Mavuika will incinerate your enemies into ash, and I'm going to explain to you her kit, teams, and tell you how to build her best. Let's get into it. First off, starting with her normal attack, which is normal at a baseline, nothing special to see here. However, her skill is where it gets interesting, because it has two modes. First off, she will gain up to 80 Night Soul, with a 5 per second drain, which means it has a total duration of 16 seconds. If you tap it, you will deal pyro damage every 2 seconds. This requires no action to be performed, so it works kind of like a Yaimiko turret, except it can target multiple enemies. And when I say multiple, I mean a lot of enemies. If you hold her skill, you will instead summon a motorcycle, which will convert your normal charge and plunge attacks into pyro damage. This is her DPS mode. You'll mainly want to be performing charge attacks, as these have the highest damage output. When we move on to her elemental burst, it gets a little special, because it does not function based on energy. Instead, it's charged by consuming Night Soul, or using normal attacks. This is called Fighting Spirit. Once you reach 100 points, the ultimate can be used, and it gets stronger the more points you have. After using it, you also gain 10 more Night Soul points, and it does a big pyro nuke of damage. You will also enter the Crucible of Life and Death for 7 seconds. Crucible of Life and Death will pause her Night Soul consumption, and also increase her normal, charge, and burst damage based on the points consumed. This counts as a multiplier increase and is not something like damage bonus. Her Ascension 1 will give her 30% attack after using a Night Soul burst, which is just a straight up damage increase. Her Ascension 4 will give a 0.2% damage bonus to the active character for every ult point consumed, which will decay over the course of 20 seconds. Which means that if you consume the full 200 Fighting Spirit, you will get a 40% damage bonus, which decays over the course of 20 seconds, so if you use it right before your DPS, they will get an average damage bonus of around 30%. For talent priority, we start with her ultimate. Even for her DPS mode, this is where the majority of her multipliers come from. And then, after that, we level up her skill. Her skill is obviously also a very big part of her multipliers, so don't forget to level this as well. Her normal attacks are useless, so you don't use these. When it comes to Mavuika's skill during the off-field, it gives more damage, but the ultimate is more front-loaded, and if it does vaporize, it will do more damage in the skill, so I recommend leveling this first. But for your Mavuika to start incinerating the Abyss, she's gonna need a good weapon. Starting with her signature obviously being the 1000 Blazing Suns. It has a high base attack of 741 along with 11% crit rate. It gives a truckload of attack percent and crit damage, especially when in Night Soul. 20% crit damage and 28% attack to be exact, and it will be increased by 75% when you're in Night Soul. It will also have its duration extend when you do normal charge attacks that do elemental damage. The timer will also pause if you are off-field. This is easily Mavuika's best in slot, and in my opinion the best claymore in the game. Next up, if you want to look for a DPS Mavuika weapon, turn to the Redhorn Stone Thresher. It's her second best in slot for damage. It gives a lot of crit damage and also extra damage to normal and charge attacks, so it makes sense. Bennett will also make up for the fact that this has a low base attack. For off-field, however, you're gonna turn towards the Serpent Spine. It's an overall good claymore for everyone. It has an okay base attack with a good crit rate. Its passive gives a lot of damage bonus, assuming you don't get hit. Next up is Beacon of the Reed Sea. It gives a good amount of base attack with some good crit rate too, also getting a nice amount of attack percent from its passive. However, it's gonna be hard to balance your substats thanks to Obsidian Codex. For some alternative 5-star weapons, you could also use Wolf's Gravestone or you could use Verdict. They both have good base attack with good substats. For your free-to-play option, you're going to be looking towards the Tidal Shadow. It gives a lot of attack percent, although it does have the requirement that you get healed. But in her teams, this should be happening almost all the time anyway. You could also turn towards Mailed Flower, which will give EM and attack percent. This is better if you run an attack percent sans for Vaporize comp. As you can see on these sheets, Blazing Suns is Mavuika's best weapon, but you'll also be able to see that her competition is not very far behind, and she is actually a rather accessible unit if you have the weapons to make it happen. Now obviously she's gonna need some artifacts as well, and for a main DPS Mavuika, you're gonna obviously stick to 4-piece Obsidian Codex. it will give you a 15% damage bonus and 40% crit rate, which is just so many stats on one set. It really does not require any further explanation, because it's just that good of a set. Your second best bet would be 4-piece Marushose Hunter, but it does require Farina Vape teams. It is only slightly worse than Obsidian, which you can see because it only has slightly less crit rate and its damage percent is slightly less applicable. So, let's be honest here, it might as well just be the same set with a little less stats, so it makes sense it's so close to Obsidian. You could also use Cinder City for DPS to buff a teammate, but that's not worth it. It is, however, worth it if you use an off-field Mavuika. Although, if you run Mavuika as a sub-DPS, the chance is pretty high that you're running her with Shalonen as well. And Shalonen is a better holder of the Cinder City set due to her lower damage output. The one team where this is not the case would be a Kinich Burning team. However, in that team, Deepwood Memories is better. If you use Mavuika as a solo Natlink character, however, you're going to use Cinder City. Otherwise, you're going to use Obsidian. Golden Troop works too, but it's not the greatest. For her stat breakpoints, Mavuika has no need for energy recharge, so you just want to roll for attack percent crit and EM for Vape teams. If you want to play main DPS Mavuika, you're going to turn towards an Elemental Mastery Sands, a Pyro damage Goblet, and a crit damage Circlet. We run EM here specifically for Vape, but if you're playing a team that doesn't use Vaporize, you're going to go for attack. For sub DPS, you're going to go for attack, Pyro, and crit damage. Attack Sands for sub DPS is mainly to make her more flexible, since she's used in more teams that aren't Vape. Speaking of Vaporize, it's time to get into Mavuika's teams. First off, we're going to talk about DPS Mavuika teams. The first team I want to talk about is a Vaporize team with Farina, Shalonen, and Bennett. Farina is enough for consistent Mavuika Vapes, so your Hydra application is there. She also gives a good damage percent buff, as all of you most likely know. Shalonen's Night Soul lets Mavuika get a lot of ult stacks, and, you know, because you're playing Shalonen, you're obviously also going to benefit from her Resistance Shred and the fact that she can run Cinder City. Bennett is, well, Bennett. His ridiculous attack buff, the fact you're able to get Pyro Resonance with him in Mavuika, and also his C6 buffing Pyro damage bonus just makes him way too good with Mavuika to skip out on. There's also Melt teams for Mavuika, with Citlali, Kazuha, and Bennett. Citlali can reduce the Pyro resistance on enemies when you trigger Melt. She's also able of running Cinder City, and again helps with charging Night Soul. You can use Kazuha to increase the Cryo application for more consistent melts. And Bennett is, again, Bennett. For Mualani teams, you can also use Mavuika as a sub-DPS. Here, you are able to apply enough Pyro for consistent Mualani Vapes. Her damage buff will also help Mualani out quite a lot. For damage, it's not too big over Shangling, but it's definitely an improvement, especially since Mavuika doesn't need to build infinite energy recharge. Kinich can also use the damage percent buff and the Pyro application, but for him, it's more so that he doesn't have to think about which direction he goes in like he had to with Shangling. Shangling also had additional issues, like the fact that if Kinich creates too much distance, you're not going to be able to hit any Pyronado hits with Shangling. So Mavuika is mainly a convenience upgrade, but also a quite noticeable damage upgrade as well, because Shangling's damage in a Kinich team is kinda bad. There's also Navia teams, in which Mavuika can do the on-fielding, whereas Navia gets turned into an E-bot. This becomes Navia's best team, and one of the better ones for Mavuika as well. This mainly is because they both really want the same supports, mainly being Shalonen, Bennett, and Farina, so you can just mix and match two of those. This will be an excellent dual carry team. There's also Overload teams. Mavuika will, much like Shangling, have good damage in this team, but there are no Night Soul teammates in the standard version. But even then, it's still an upgrade. You could use Auroron over Sorrow Official for a Night Soul character if you wanted to, but it's not needed. If you want to play Mavuika as a sub-DPS for Melt, she might not be able to apply enough Pyro, but if she does, she will again be an upgrade over Shangling. But I know a lot of you have been saving for Mavuika for a very long time, so you probably want to know how good her Constellations are. Starting with the C1, it will give her a maximum Night Soul of 120 instead of 80, and it will also allow her Fighting Spirit to generate 25% faster. This helps her charge her ult more even when you do not have Night Soul teammates, which is very nice. You will also gain a 40% attack buff after gaining Fighting Spirit, which will be essentially 100% uptime. This is a very strong C1. Her C2 is downright ridiculous. During Night Soul, you will gain a 200 base attack buff, and for off-field mode, the defense of nearby enemies will be shredded by 20%. For on-field mode, when we're talking about the on-field mode, she will get a damage increase in the form of multipliers for her normal charge attacks and also her burst. Her normal attacks will get a buff of 60%, her charge attacks will be buffed by 90%, and then her burst will be buffed by 120%. This is just a downright insane damage increase, and just an absurd constellation on the whole. Her C3 will level up her ultimate, which is her most important talent, so it's a very good constellation. The C4 makes her Ascension 4 not drain over time, and it will also increase the damage percent buff by 10%. It's pretty decent, but it's not revolutionary. The C5 will level up the E, which is again pretty good. And then when we get to C6, when you're in her tap E stance, you will deal extra hits of pyro damage with her bike when the off-field mode attacks. For on-field, once every 3 seconds, you will also get an additional hit of pyro damage, and much like her C2's off-field mode, you will also gain a 20% defense reduction when you are close by to enemies. This is a very good constellation as well, and a very sizable damage increase for Mavuika. As the Archon, Mavuika has a lot of hype to fulfill, and I think she does a very good job at it. While there are some parts of her kit that I don't agree with, ultimately, I am not Hoyoverse, and thus I cannot impose my changes upon her. All in all, Mavuika does a great job at pulling up the Natlan roster, while also giving herself a unique identity within the game's meta. Did you learn something from this guide? If you did, like and subscribe. And if you still have a question, be sure to comment it down below. If you want to make sure that I answer, however, be sure to join my Discord or message me on Twitter, which are both linked in the description. But that'll be it from me. Peace.